Julius Schaub. As the Third Reich was collapsing, Julius Schaub, chief of Adolf Hitler's personal aides and one of the longest-serving men in his inner circle, found himself trapped in a paradox typical of the intimate circles of power. He had seen and managed the dictator's everyday details for decades, yet in the moment of collapse, his role was reduced to erasing traces. In the final days of April 1945, with Berlin encircled, Hitler gave Schaub a specific and repeated order to destroy documents and personal effects. Schaub burned papers from safes and storage facilities linked to the chancellery and the bunker, and he also received instructions to eliminate materials kept outside the capital, including belongings and files associated with the dictator's residences and stopping places. This type of task was no minor detail. Schaub was not just any administrative secretary, but the custodian of what Hitler considered private, which included correspondence, notes, objects, and material that could prove compromising or, at the very least, useful for reconstructing routines, relationships, and decisions within the inner circle. That final stretch marks the breaking point in his story. From that moment on, Schaub ceased to be the man with the briefcase and became just another fugitive in a defeated country. According to available records, he attempted to move around with false documents and even presented himself under the name Josef Huber. He was arrested by US troops on May 8, 1945, in Kitzbühel, Austria. His capture was not the immediate end of the case, but rather the beginning of a long period of custody and investigation. Schaub remained detained until February 17, 1949. During those years, the Allied focus on figures like him combined two key questions. What did a man positioned so close to the dictator really know, and above all, what could actually be proven through documentary or testimonial evidence? In the post-war period, proximity to Hitler was in itself a charged element, but legal proceedings depended on categories and concrete proof. This is where the key point of his exit from the judicial labyrinth appears. In the denazification proceedings, Schaub was classified as a Mitläufer, literally meaning a follower or fellow traveler, a category that, in practical terms, placed him below the major criminally responsible figures to whom decision-making power, policy design, or direct leadership of repression and extermination were attributed. Along the same lines, available references indicate that he was neither charged with nor formally linked to war crimes. At the same time, photojournalistic records place the resolution of his case in Germany in early 1949. Schaub is mentioned as having been acquitted by the Munich II Regional Court on February 21, 1949. That date aligns with the end of his period of custody and with the typical outcome for several members of the regime's administrative and service environment. Lengthy interrogations, reviews, denazification classification, and finally, discreet reintegration into post-war Germany. From that point on, Schaub withdrew into a low-profile life. Unlike other names from Nazism who remained tied to emblematic trials or decades of international pursuit, his later trajectory is not associated with any relevant public role or visible post-war militancy in general sources. His biography, in documentable terms, closes with simple facts. He died on December 27, 1967, in Munich, his city of birth. Wilhelm Bruckner. If Julius Schaub was until the end the executor of Hitler's private orders, Wilhelm Bruckner represents another type of closeness, that of the old guard, which over time was pushed aside by internal intrigues even before defeat arrived. Bruckner had been Hitler's chief of aides during the second half of the 1930s, with direct authority over the personnel surrounding the Führer, assistants, ushers, valets, bodyguards, and military aides. It was a position that combined logistics, access, and control of the leader of the Reich's human perimeter. But his fall within the organizational chart came before 1945. In October 1940, he ceased to be chief of aides, replaced precisely by Schaub. According to biographical accounts, this replacement was linked to the growing influence of Martin Bormann and the reconfiguration of the immediate circle during wartime. Bruckner, who had been visible and well known within the chancellery, faded into the background, and that displacement ultimately had a decisive consequence for his fate. When the Third Reich disintegrated, Bruckner was no longer at the nerve center of the bunker, nor within the last-minute decision-making structure. Formally, his trajectory during the conflict also changed. He joined the Heer, the regular army, and by the end of the war, he had reached the rank of colonel. This detail may seem bureaucratic, but it is not. In the post-war period, the Allies and denazification courts tended to assess differently those who remained in party power structures versus those who had ended up within the conventional military apparatus, even if the boundary was often morally insufficient. After the German capitulation, Bruckner was interned by US military authorities. According to biographical summaries, this internment lasted from 1945 to 1948. This is a key period because it highlights a difference from others close to Hitler. Bruckner was not detained for weeks or months, but for years. This suggests that even outside the final inner circle, he was still considered a valuable witness to the regime's internal machinery, as well as a subject to be classified within the hierarchy of responsibilities the Allies sought to construct in occupied Germany. Denazification in practice was not a single formula, but a system that varied by zones and over time, shaped by political needs and by the evolving course of the Cold War. Even so, the categories mattered. They could determine loss of property, employment restrictions, periods of internment or forced labor, and the degree of legal stigma. In Bruckner's case, the ruling most often cited is specific and dated. On September 14, 1948, he was classified as a major offender or principal culprit with a sentence of 3.5 years in a labor camp and the partial confiscation of his assets. This verdict sets him apart from other members of Hitler's domestic entourage who, in different proceedings, were labeled merely as followers or Mitläufer. Bruckner was not just a service employee. He had held rank, command, and a real level of authority over the Führer's personal apparatus during years when the regime was already fully consolidated. His conviction, even if it does not place him at the criminal pinnacle of Nazism, does reflect that post-war authorities considered him more than a passive bystander. After 1948, Bruckner's story becomes less visible, as happened with many mid-level figures of the Reich, who, without being emblematic defendants in major international trials, faded into West Germany under a low profile, with administrative records and personal trajectories that rarely returned to the headlines. In his case, the final fact is simple and almost stark. He died on August 18, 1954, in Herbsdorf, Upper Bavaria, in West Germany. Emil Maurice. In Adolf Hitler's intimate sphere, Emil Maurice occupies a rare position. He was among the earliest members, present before power enveloped everything, when the movement was still a mix of meetings, street violence, and personal loyalties. A watchmaker by trade, Maurice became connected to Hitler from the early years of the German Workers' Party and eventually assumed a very specific role. His first personal driver, a man who not only drove him but was physically embedded in the leader's daily routine. That early proximity gave him a symbolic status that remained with him, even when he was no longer at the center of attention. His biography also includes an element that seemed incompatible with the regime. Within the framework of the SS's increasingly rigid racial requirements, Maurice was exposed due to a family background that Heinrich Himmler deemed problematic. The outcome was one of those exceptions that reveal how real power worked. Hitler intervened to protect his old acquaintance, and Maurice received special treatment that allowed him to remain within the SS universe despite internal pressure. This episode was not a minor domestic detail. It signaled what it meant to have been there before everyone else in the dictator's personal orbit. During the war, however, that initial closeness no longer translated into decisive influence. Maurice did not become a major operational commander. His profile remained between the political and organizational spheres within the Nazi system, and in military terms, he served as an officer in the Luftwaffe for a limited period, between 1940 and 1942. This trajectory reflects someone who adapted to the Reich's needs without becoming a frontline figure. The collapse of 1945 affected him like so many others, no longer as the founder or the man behind the wheel, but as a name in a file. US forces captured him on May 25, 1945, in Starnberg, south of Munich, an area that at the time saw the movement of soldiers, bureaucrats, and party members trying to disappear into the chaos of surrender. For someone with his past, the capture was not merely an arrest. It marked the beginning of an evaluation. How active had Maurice actually been, and how much had he remained a symbol of Hitler's old entourage? The official answer came through the denazification process. In 1948, he was tried and sentenced to 4 years in a labor camp, classified as Class II, meaning an offender within that scale, above the level of a passive follower. This point is important. Maurice was not automatically excused for being just a driver. The post-war authorities treated him as an active participant in the apparatus, though not as a principal architect of the regime's major crimes. After serving the core of his sentence, his story takes a different tone. Unlike figures who spent decades in courtrooms, or those who fled for years, Maurice returned to a life that seemed like a chronological step backward. He went back to watchmaking and reintegrated into West Germany's civilian economy. Records indicate that by 1951 he already owned a watch shop in Munich. This detail, more than anecdotal, illustrates a typical pattern among many early Nazi cadres who, without being caught in major international trials, ended up rebuilding commercial normalcy in a country reorganizing itself under new rules and alliances. His death also carries that mix of precision and obscurity that often surrounds secondary historical figures. The most cited sources place his death on February 6, 1972, with slight discrepancies regarding the exact location. Between Starnberg and Munich, two very close points. Karl Brandt. Unlike other friends or close associates of Hitler whose power was intimate and domestic, Karl Brandt belonged to the most dangerous category, personal proximity transformed into state authority. He was a physician and surgeon and served for years as Hitler's personal doctor. That position was not limited to health checkups or consultations. In a regime where the leader ruled through quick signatures and verbal orders, the doctor at his side could become a political cog with direct access and the ability to translate wishes into administrative measures. The turning point was that Brandt did not remain confined to the private sphere. He was appointed Reich Commissioner for Health and Sanitation, and his name became associated with one of the darkest policies of the Nazi state. The program to kill people deemed incurable or unfit, presented under the deceptive term of mercy death. In the documentation later cited in studies and encyclopedias, there is an order in which Hitler charged Brandt, along with Philipp Böhler, with expanding the authority of certain physicians to grant a merciful death to patients considered beyond cure. Such bureaucratic phrasing condensed a brutal reality. The state medicalized murder and dressed it as a clinical decision. When the war ended and the Reich collapsed, Brandt became an obvious target for the Allies. He was no longer just a member of Hitler's circle, but a state official responsible for health policies and structures that, by their nature, were connected to systematic crimes. In the post-war period, such a profile typically led to one of two outcomes, either prolonged flight and concealment, or capture and the construction of an exemplary legal case. In Brandt's case, it was the latter. The Nuremberg Trials were not a single proceeding, but a series of trials. Among the so-called subsequent cases, the doctor's trial was the first major U.S. tribunal following the International Military Tribunal. Its formal title left no room for metaphor: United States of America versus Karl Brandt et al. The proceedings focused on physicians and administrators accused of organizing or participating in war crimes and crimes against humanity through medical experiments and procedures imposed on prisoners and civilians. The trial began on December 9, 1946, and concluded on August 20, 1947. Brandt appeared as a central defendant. His figure symbolized the fusion of medicine, party, and state. In images from the time, he can be seen testifying, transformed into evidentiary material for a system that, during the war, had presented itself as scientific modernity and, upon collapse, revealed itself as planned criminality. The charges in the doctor's trial included war crimes, crimes against humanity, and membership in a criminal organization, in a framework in which the tribunal sought to show that these were not individual excesses by certain doctors, but a pattern: forced experimentation, victim selection, and the use of health institutions as instruments of violence. Within this framework, Brandt was not a technician signing papers. He was a coordinating figure with legitimacy granted by Hitler himself and the Reich apparatus. The verdict was severe. Brandt was sentenced to death, and the sentence was carried out by hanging. Records list the execution date as June 2, 1948, at Landsberg Prison in Allied-occupied Germany. August Gustl Kubizek was neither a party official, commander, nor bureaucrat. His closeness to Adolf Hitler belongs to a period before all that, the years of adolescence and early youth in Linz and Vienna, when Hitler was still an aspiring artist with no real political position. Precisely for this reason, Kubizek's post-war fate was peculiar. For the Allied investigators, he was less a cog in the regime and more a potential witness to the early formation of the dictator. A useful piece for reconstructing the human origins of the figure Europe had just defeated. In 1945, this potential value mixed with another concern: the objects and mementos Kubizek had preserved over decades. According to biographical accounts, in December 1945, he gathered memories linked to his friendship with Hitler and carefully hid them in the basement of his home in Eferding, Upper Austria. It was a defensive gesture, but also a signal that he understood the significance of those papers, postcards, and sketches. They were not simple souvenirs, but material that could become evidence, leverage, or a political trigger in the climate of occupation and denazification. Shortly after hiding these items, Kubizek was arrested by US forces. He was sent to the Glassenbach internment camp near Salzburg, which served as a custody and interrogation center for various individuals connected to Nazism and the Reich administration. There, he was questioned by the US Army Criminal Investigation Division. This detail is important for two reasons. First, it confirms that his case was not treated as a simple administrative check. Second, it shows the specific interest in his relationship with Hitler and the potential existence of correspondence, sketches, or material testimonies from that early period. His house was searched, but the hidden documents and sketches were not found, at least according to the available biographical reconstruction. This explains why, despite investigative pressure, Kubizek was not immediately reduced to a source who handed over material under custody, part of what he had simply remained out of reach. After more than a year in this cycle of detention and interrogation, he was released on April 8, 1947. Over the years, his figure entered another kind of debate, the domain of narratives. In the post-war period, German society and the publishing world were flooded with memoirs, confessions, defenses, and reconstructions. Kubizek received offers to publish his testimony, but reportedly declined them for a time. Finally, in 1951, he agreed to prepare his book for an Austrian publisher with a title that left no doubt about his intent: Adolf Hitler, My Childhood Friend. The book appeared in 1953 and caused a stir, not by revealing military secrets, but by offering a domestic and early image of Hitler prior to the war and his rise to power. In this sense, Kubizek assumed a specific role in public memory, the witness of the before. His text, later translated into other languages, fueled both curiosity and debate over the reliability of a recollection that, by definition, was filtered through decades of distance, and the incomparable weight of what Hitler had become. Even so, Kubizek's stance was clear on one point. He insisted that despite the definitive end of 1945, he would not deny that a friendship had existed in youth. This statement, cited in the book's biographical tradition, reveals the type of person Kubizek was in the post-war years, not a visible political activist, but also not someone willing to reconstruct his life through a complete public rupture with his youthful past. His story, after publication, closes quickly. He died on October 23, 1956, at age 68 in Linz, and was buried in Eferding, the place where he had lived and hidden those memories in 1945. Ernst Putzi Hamstengel. Ernst Putzi Hamstengel was perhaps the strangest close friend in Hitler's circle. Cosmopolitan, bilingual, Harvard-educated, a talented pianist, and at the same time one of the first social bridges that helped dress up a still marginal movement in interwar Munich with respectability. When Nazism came to power, Hamstengel held a role that combined personal influence with public function. He is often described as a key figure in managing contacts and Hitler's external image, and even served as the head of Hitler's foreign press. But his story did not end in the chancellery or the bunker. Unlike other close associates, Hamstengel exited the system before the end. Once the regime was consolidated, he began losing position due to internal friction, particularly with Joseph Goebbels' propaganda apparatus, and his relationship with Hitler became unstable. In this context, one of the most cited episodes occurred. He received sealed orders for an alleged mission trip, which he interpreted as a dangerous maneuver. Shortly afterward, he departed, first to Switzerland, then to the United Kingdom. The war thus found him outside the Reich, but that did not mean freedom. In Britain, he was interned as an enemy alien at the outbreak of the conflict, and later transferred to Canada with other detainees, following the British policy of relocating certain internees away from the mainland. This detail is crucial because it marks a definitive turning point. Hamstengel was no longer a protected member of the Nazi court. He was a German with an inconvenient past, detained by the Allies and turned into a potential source. In 1942, the most singular turn of his life occurred. He was handed over to the United States and began collaborating with the Roosevelt administration on an intelligence project known as the S Project. From June 1942 to September 1944, he worked as an analyst and consultant, providing profiles and information on Nazi officials and especially on Hitler. According to the most widely cited biographical summary, he provided data on hundreds of leaders and prepared extensive material on the dictator's personality and private habits. In 1943, his contributions were incorporated into the famous Office of Strategic Services report on Hitler's personality, compiled by US specialists seeking to anticipate the Nazi leader's behavior and reactions. The important point here is not to romanticize the defection, but to understand the political calculation. For Washington, Hanfstaengl was valuable because he had been close, knew internal dynamics, and could describe personal traits, information useful for psychological intelligence and propaganda. For him, collaborating was also a means of survival, a way to reposition himself on the winning side with a unique asset, his old intimacy with Hitler. In 1944, he was returned to British custody and, after the end of the war, repatriated to Germany. This return placed him in the grey area of the post-war period. He could not present himself as a lifelong resister, as his name was tied to the Nazi rise, yet he was also not a functionary captured in 1945 in active service. His fate, like that of many peripheral high-access figures, was retreat and writing. In 1957, he published a memoir, later reissued with other titles, in which he reconstructed his relationship with Hitler and the lost pre-war years. Once settled in Munich, he remained an occasional source for journalists and researchers, more for what he had witnessed in the 1920s and 1930s than for any real influence in post-war Germany. His biography closes without epic. He died on November 6, 1975, in Munich, West Germany. Heinz Ling was probably Adolf Hitler's most literal close associate, the valet who managed his daily routine, clothing, immediate access, schedule, and in the final days, even the practical details of an end that Hitler himself sought to control until the last minute. Linge was neither a minister nor a strategist, but his position made him a direct witness to scenes that, after 1945, became objects of political obsession: Hitler's death, the fate of his remains, and the body of evidence that could settle rumors. Linge had worked with Hitler since 1935 and was in the Führer bunker on April 30, 1945. From that point on, his life became tied to a single question: what exactly happened in the final hours? In the chaos of the bunker, his role shifted from domestic to operational. Among his tasks, one repeatedly appears in various accounts: the destruction of material traces of the suicide and the bodies. Post-war narratives about Hitler's end were built not only from major documents, but also on small, brutal actions: moving a body, removing a blood-stained carpet, burning remains, improvising a grave under enemy fire. Historically, this made Ling a highly sought-after witness. Leaving the bunker in the early hours of May first did not lead to freedom, but to almost inevitable capture. Linge was apprehended by the Red Army in Berlin, and his identity was soon revealed. Biographical sources place his capture near the Seestrasse area, and once confirmed, he was transferred to custody in Moscow, where he was imprisoned in the Lubyanka prison. In the Soviet logic, a witness like him was more than a prisoner of war. He was an intelligence asset. The Soviet state needed to establish its own account of Hitler's end and, if possible, shield it from doubts, leaks, or Western versions. His captivity was long. He spent approximately 10 years detained by the Soviets and was released in 1955. That alone distinguishes him from several men in Hitler's circle who ended up in US or British hands and went through relatively shorter denazification processes. For Linge, the post-war period was not first a tribunal and classification. It was isolation, interrogation, and political control of his testimony. Biographical summaries note that both he and Otto Günsche were intensely questioned by Soviet security organs and at times placed in solitary confinement. A central episode of this period is that Linge ultimately participated, under pressure and supervision, in the preparation of a dossier for the Soviet leadership. According to biographical reconstructions, Ling and Günsche shared a cell during part of 1948 to 1949 and provided details for a file compiled by Soviet officers, presented to Joseph Stalin on December 30, 1949. This material would be published decades later as the Hitler Book. This point is significant because it shows what Moscow sought: not just to know what happened, but to appropriate the testimony and turn it into a document of the Soviet state. As often happens with prisoners subjected to prolonged interrogations, his account was not linear. Sources note that Ling made statements he later modified or corrected. For example, he initially claimed to have heard the gunshot of Hitler's suicide and later explained he had said so to avoid seeming weak in areas of uncertain memory. He also reportedly corrected details about how Eva Braun's body was wrapped. This should not be read as simple truth or falsehood. It is a typical pattern of testimonies produced under extreme conditions, where the interrogated tries to maintain coherence, satisfy the interrogators, or protect themselves from consequences. When Linger left Soviet custody in 1955, his return to West Germany did not automatically make him a publicly free man. Post-war Germany lived with two opposing forces. On one hand, the desire to close chapters. On the other, the need to establish judicial and administrative accounts of concrete events. In 1956, Linger testified before a court in West Germany during an investigation into Hitler's death. The importance of this instance is clear. It was not historical curiosity, but a legal and political response to persistent doubts and alternative narratives. In parallel, his name remained linked to debates about Hitler's remains. In a context where theories circulated about Hitler's supposed survival, Linger stated that the dictator's body was not identified as such, inferring this from the repeated types of questions the Soviets asked him for years. Beyond the exact value of this interpretation, it reveals another fact. Ling left the USSR having experienced being used as a state witness and suspecting that Soviet authorities sought not only to clarify events but also to control the narrative. Heinz Linger died on March 9, 1980, in Hamburg, West Germany.